I was almost kidnapped and beheaded as a child. Before I start this story, there is some mention of violence towards children. It's not explained in any graphic detail, but it is there. I want you to know that. I've always wanted to share this story. I have no real way of proving my credibility, but if you ever visited or lived in a rural part of South Asia, you can probably vouch for me in saying that this is more plausible than one might assume. Also, this ended up being a lot longer than I thought, but I wanted to recount it precisely the way that I have remembered it all these times. I've had one of those moments recently where a lot of things came together in my brain to make sense of an event that my childhood mind couldn't properly comprehend at the time. So my mother was born and raised in the UK, but she is of South Asian descent. And since I'm mixed, she tries really hard to make me be in touch with my culture in any way possible. This meant that as a child, we made a lot of frequent visits back home. It's like every summer I can remember we spent there, and then it suddenly just stopped after this specific incident. My mom's family back home live in an extremely rural part of the country. There is a lot of poverty surrounding our family home, so we rarely left our relatively nice part of the village. I was never allowed to go out and explore and come home from the concrete jungle that is London. I always so curious about it. I'm going to explain what happened on this one particular day the way I remembered experiencing it, and then I'll explain what I failed to realize at that time. I was 8 at the time. One of my uncles from a neighboring village would come to visit his children, and when they did, my mom would let me go with them to a small hut-like shop that sold sweets and snacks. It was like 15 minutes away from the family home. My cousins were 11 and 19 and both male, and it was broad daylight. To get to the shop, we walked through a small DIY road, and on both sides is what I would call the jungle. It was basically just lots of trees, bushes as far as you can see. You really can't see anything beyond those trees, it's just a lot of greenery. I'm mixed with East Asian, and I definitely get my looks from my dad's side, so being an obvious foreigner in a rural part of back home meant that I was pretty used to strangers staring and asking me all sorts of questions. I was also used to creepy men that would tell me I was beautiful because I have pale skin. My mother warned me about these men and made sure I knew to stay away from them. So the road to the hut was paved with creepy people making creepy comments and my cousins basically telling them to leave me alone in less pleasant terms. There was also a group of young guys. Some of them had motorbikes and some were just chilling. One of them waved at me. He seemed friendly enough, and I had met so many people that my mom was convinced I must remember from last time that I had zero recollection of, so I just waved back and went about my day. Once we got to the hut, we immediately started losing our self-control with the snacks. The owner was super friendly, and he let us try a bunch of sweets. He also had a coffee ice cream for the first time. I distinctly remember being really excited because my mom and one of the ladies that worked as a cook both loved coffee ice cream, so I thought it'd be a nice surprise for the both of them. I asked for 3 and the nice guy gave me 4, and so my hands were full and they were quickly melting, and he told me to run, go home quickly. I told my cousins I would be getting a running start, and once they finished, they could catch up to me. I would be there in their line of sight. Plus, it was daylight outside, and it was a busy road. I start running back. There were a few older aunties stood at the top of the road, and something about their presence gave me a sense of, I guess now, false security. I felt a lot safer knowing they were there, though, and paired with the fact that my cousins were also able to see me clearly, I felt comfortable enough to just walk back leisurely, minding my own business, eating my ice cream. I passed the group of guys, and the one that waved at me came over to me. He said I was X's niece, right? X being my uncle. And he jokingly took one of the ice creams and said, "Hey, she got an ice cream for Mama." Mama means uncle in our language, so I just assumed he was a friend of my uncle's or something like that. He asked me when I arrived and how I was finding the country. He was so friendly, and he did not look like the stereotypical creep. When I said I was going to go home, he said, why don't you let your uncle take you? You can ride on my motorbike. I think that's when something clicked in my mind, that he wasn't being the friendly uncle I thought he was. That's also when I realized I was pretty much circled in and was surrounded by the group of older men. It's also when I realized I could not see my cousins or the group of old ladies, which also meant they probably couldn't see me either. I wish I could explain in words how helpless and afraid I was. I had all the threats in the world explained to me by my mother in a country where I knew I was vulnerable and had to be cautious, and I still managed to find myself in a dangerous situation. Luckily, my cousins came running and shouting, probably because I was their responsibility, and the guys ran off into the jungle once again. This creeped me out because there was nothing in the jungle. It was just trees as far as I could see, and I knew that it would be nearly impossible to find them in all of that. We caused quite the scene, and the villagers seemed to react as if they were already on edge. When we told my family what happened, I was basically on house arrest, and my mom refused me out of her sight. I was pretty shook up about the whole situation, and so, honestly, I was kind of grateful for that. I put it down to my paranoia, but at the time, I would get overwhelming feelings of being watched. Our village is quite small. Like, amongst them is everyone knows everyone sort of situation. My uncle is a big community figure, and he's very well known amongst the villagers, which is why the men probably put two and two together and that I was his niece. Having foreign family over is usually a pretty big deal, and having a niece that is mixed race is also a very, very, very big deal to them. I'm sure word got around. He realized that there was a group of men on motorbikes who would frequently go past our house. They stayed at a decent distance from our house, though, and they weren't anyone we would have known. It's creepy to think about how the lengths they were going to, you know? A couple days before we were due to fly back, I had my second, last, and worst encounter with this particular friendly uncle. It was nighttime. And it was like every other nighttime when we were just playing board games, card games in the front room. Now, because it was so hot, I went to my bedroom and I was playing my Nintendo DS. What a throwback. When I saw, out of the corner of my eye, someone at the window, staring directly at me. It was him. Now, the worst part is that he had the most creepy, sick, twisted smile I had ever seen in my whole entire life. He put a finger to his lips, but I did the literal opposite and started screaming hysterically. I've been on edge since the ice cream incident, so what might seem like an overreaction was just my very natural responses to that situation. I can't really tell you what happened next because no one has ever told me. My very large uncle and his also very large friends are not known to be the friendliest of people, but I was told he was dealt with and that he would never bother me again. We recently viewed a wedding film from one of my cousin's weddings, and part of the film was her leaving to go to the venue. And I noticed that the jungle was no longer there. It had basically been cut down. For the first time, I could see beyond the greenery. That's when my mother explained to me that my uncle had it cut down not long after that particular visit because of the head cutters. It sounds really sinister, but even more sinister in my native language. My entire life, I've been wondering what would have happened to me if I got on the motorbike. By now, I know with reasonable certainty what his intentions were. Now, during that time, a gang had been kidnapping beggar children. It took the while for a village to realize because it's not unusual for beggar children to just go missing. When we were there, people were vaguely aware that it was becoming a trend. A couple months later, a head was found. It became known in our village, but people tried to keep it quiet to avoid getting a bad name. The problem went away once a lot of the greenery was cut down, so there was nothing left to hide. But it's also when they realized the magnitude of what had happened. The weird thing is I've known about the head cutters for a while. I knew it was something that had occurred in our village, but for some reason, until recently, I never put two and two together. But now that I have, I often think about nearly what happened to me, but more importantly, what happened to a handful of young, innocent children in our little village. I think about the fact that beyond our relatively small circle, no one thinks about them. No one is haunted by their deaths, those beggar boys. So, to the creepy uncle with a motorbike, let's not meet again. I wish the children had never met you, and I hope no one else ever has the misfortune of meeting you ever again.